We've had a ceremony in the rotunda, a moment of remembrance for the 5th anniversary of the hostilities in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so members will be coming. I think it's best that we get started because we also have had fairly contentious days on the floor of the House of Representatives over the last couple of days, so we'll try to weave all of this in between that schedule. But thank you so much in advance for being here today and for the testimony that we will receive. One of the primary focuses of this committee has been to make college more affordable and accessible so that every qualified student has the opportunity to go to college. We began last year by enacting a $20 billion increase in additional federal college aid over the next 5 years. In addition to providing low and middle income students with a much needed financial relief when paying for college, this new law also makes historic investments of more than $500 million in the historical black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions and other minority serving schools. HBCUs provide critical higher education opportunities for African American, low income, and educationally disadvantaged Americans. Historically, the historical black colleges and universities have played an especially significant role in opening the doors of college to African American students. During times of slavery and segregation, the HBCUs were the only institution that would admit African American students. Today, these colleges and universities are playing an increasing role in helping students succeed in college and strengthening our workforce and our economy. The National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education released a new report just today showing the significant strides that black colleges are making to increase access to higher education and to boost our nation's global competitiveness. In 1994, slightly fewer than 1 million African American students were enrolled in either a 2-year or 4-year undergraduate institutions, making up just over 9% of all college students. By 2004, the African American student enrollment had more than doubled, comprising about 13% of all college students. Over the past decade, enrollment rates at historical black colleges and universities have grown at a much faster rate than enrollment rates of all college students. Although historical black colleges and universities represent only 3% of all colleges and universities, they enroll close to a third of all African American students. They serve a disproportionate number of all African American students pursuing careers that are critical to our competitiveness of this nation. 40% of their students pursue a 4-year degree in science, technology, engineering, and math, and about half of all African American students in teaching fields attend HBCUs. But despite this progress, these institutions continue to face a unique set of challenges, including the limited resources and budgets. The historical black colleges and universities tend to have smaller endowments than other comparable institutions. Another recent study by the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education found that during the 2004-2005 school year, not a single historical black college and university ranked among the top 120 endowments in the country. Sadly, President Bush's recently released fiscal year 2009 budget proposes harmful cuts to the funding for historical black colleges and universities and other minority-serving schools, which would only worsen the financial challenges that these schools face. In addition, many historical black colleges and universities are in significant need of repair and renovation, especially those that are still feeling the devastating effects of Hurricane Katrina. And some disparities still persist between students attending historical black colleges and universities and students at other comparable schools. Part of the reason the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education has pursued a compact agreement with several states to root out discrimination that minority students face. Clearly, there remains a great deal of work ahead to ensure that students at historical black colleges and universities and other minority-serving schools have the same opportunity as students at other colleges. I am pleased to say that this Congress and this committee have taken some important steps to address these changes. In addition to our newly passed student aid law, the House also recently passed the College Opportunity and Affordability Act, H.R. 4137, which increases the amount of funding for historical black colleges and universities would receive for capital projects and repairs. It also expands funding eligibility for graduate student programs at HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions and addresses the challenges of starting and growing endowments at these schools. Today, we will examine the tremendous accomplishments of private and public historical black colleges and universities and learn more about the obstacles they continue to face. We will also hear more about the purpose of the compact agreements and whether or not the Office of Civil Rights is doing enough to protect the interests of students attending historical black colleges and universities. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, many of whom are in town for the National Association Equal Opportunity of Higher Education's annual conference. Providing all Americans with equal educational opportunities is at the center of our nation's civil rights history and shared values. It's a core part of our efforts to give everyone a chance to pursue the American dream. At this time, I would like to recognize the senior Republican on the Education and Labor Committee, Congressman McKean, my colleague from California, who has been working for many years while he was in the majority and now in the minority to push this committee to report and the Congress to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. And we're now in conference through a great deal of his work and all the members of this committee, and I want to recognize him for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and thank you for those kind words, and it's good to be working with you again this morning here. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to discuss the great value of historically black colleges and universities and what an important role they play in the post-secondary education environment. As with any institution or policy, HBCUs certainly face challenges, but that must not sidetrack us from recognizing the incredible void that was filled when historically black colleges were included and defined in the Higher Education Act. Traditionally, HBCUs have provided diverse and distinguished institutions of post-secondary learning for African Americans, with as many as 14% of all African American students currently enrolled in such institutions nationwide. Today, we also find HBCUs have expanded in scope and depth to include young people from all races at over 100 different 2- and 4-year public and private institutions across the nation. Historically black colleges and universities serve some of our most disadvantaged students, who in some cases would not have had the opportunity to earn a degree and benefit from the enriching experiences of higher education. Therefore, the contributions made by HBCUs deserve our recognition. In many cases, HBCUs do not have access to the resources or endowment income of other colleges and universities, and yet they continue to provide a quality education to some of the neediest students in the country. Over the years, Congress has worked to improve the nation's support for historically black colleges and universities. Many of these institutions and their students rely on federal grant and loan programs. Under the Higher Education Amendments of 1998, Congress made significant improvements to programs designed to aid HBCUs in strengthening their institutions and graduate and professional programs. Changes allowed institutions to use federal money to build their endowments and to provide scholarships and fellowships for disadvantaged graduate and professional students. Title III of the Higher Education Act, which Congress is in the midst of reauthorizing, provides HBCUs with additional funds. Between 1995 and 2008, congressional funding for the Strengthening Historically Black Colleges and Universities program rose from $109 million to $238 million, a 118% increase over the last 13 years. Additionally, funding for the HBCU graduate program increased from $19.6 million to $56.9 million this year, an increase of 190%. HBCUs and all traditional colleges and universities, for that matter, continue to face the challenge of the skyrocketing cost of a college education. Some colleges and universities have taken steps to hold down costs by exercising greater administrative efficiency and embracing innovative approaches such as giving students the option of renting textbooks, a small step that can save students hundreds of dollars each year. This is a subject I've addressed aggressively over the last decade because I believe all post-secondary institutions should provide greater transparency of how and where student tuition dollars are being spent. It's my understanding that today's hearing is also intended to examine the implementation of desegregation agreements, which were put into place to erase remaining vestiges of discrimination in our nation's past. Given the importance of this topic, I'm surprised that we will not hear directly from one of the states that have worked to wipe out discrimination in their higher education system. After all, it's the states that entered into these agreements and the states that bear responsibility for fairly and fully promoting equality in their post-secondary system. I'm pleased to have this distinguished panel of witnesses here before us, and I'm interested to hear how some of the nation's HBCUs are addressing the college cost issue, issues of college access, and other challenges in a competitive 21st century economy. Thanks to each of you for being here today. The work you're doing for our most disadvantaged students is to be commended. HBCUs provide a remarkable avenue for African American young people and all young people to gain a quality education and are a source of pride for their communities and our nation. Chairman Miller, we share the same desire of seeing our nation's students gain greater access to a college education. So I thank you for dedicating this time to examining the historically black colleges and universities, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks, and all members will have the opportunity to enter opening remarks into the record of this hearing.
Mr. Chairman.
This will not be the
Chairman.
just 1 second, Bobby. If this will not be the last that we hear about the compacts, but we had the opportunity today to have these magnificent leaders in town all at one time, and we thought we would take advantage of it. So I want to just respond to what Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an extremely important hearing, but I want to express the reason why I will have to leave in a few minutes. The Congressional Black Caucus budget is on the floor in 15 minutes, and I think the panelists would rather me be on the floor trying to get some more money than being at the hearing. So I thank you for allowing me to make that comment.
So you think they're that pragmatic just about budgets? Mr. Payne.
I, too, will have to leave at 10:30. I chair the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health, and we're having a hearing today on child survival, reducing child mortality around the world. So unfortunately, I, too, will have to leave at 10:30. But I'm telling you. But I really look forward to reading the testimony, and we will do all we can to assist you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a magnificent panel, and we're going to begin with the Honorable Hazel O'Leary, who is president of Fisk University. President O'Leary has been the head of Fisk University since 2004. President O'Leary was most recently served as president of the international energy consulting firm O'Leary & Associates that she founded in 1997 to focus on issues of corporate change, leadership, and arms control. She also served as president and chief operating officer of Blaylock & Partners, a top-ranked African-American investment banking firm in New York. During the first administration of President Bill Clinton, President O'Leary served as the U.S. Secretary of Energy, where she did some great groundbreaking work. And thank you, Madam Secretary, Madam President, Madam, all these things, my gosh. Dr. Dorothy Yancy is president of Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Dorothy Yancy is president of the Johnson C. Smith University and came to the university as a student and then returned in 1994 to serve as the first woman appointed to the position. And previously, Dr. Yancy served as professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology for 22 years. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Social Science from Johnson C. Smith University, a Master of Arts degree from History from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a PhD in Political Science from Atlanta University. Raymond Pierce is the Dean of North Carolina Central Law School in Durham, North Carolina. Dean Pierce became Dean of North Carolina Central Law School in 2005, and prior to serving as Dean of the Law School, Mr. Pierce was a partner in the national firm of Baker & Hostetler from 1993 to 2000. Mr. Pierce served as President Bill Clinton's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, where he managed the enforcement of civil rights laws in education and the development of federal civil rights education policy. And I think, Mr. Scott, you're going to, Mr. Sarbanes? Or Mr. Yarmouth, excuse me. Mr. Yarmouth is going to do the next introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the great honor of introducing a fellow Kentuckian and a very distinguished one who has dedicated her life to higher education. She's in her 5th year of a very successful term of service as president of Kentucky State University in Frankfort, coming to us after an 8-year tenure at the University of Texas at Dallas. She has more initials after her name than in it, with a literally, with a bachelor's degree from Tougaloo College, a master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, both all in sociology, and an MBA from Abilene Christian College in Dallas. To accompany all those degrees are an equally impressive list of honors, including the Women of Excellence Award, Texas Women of Distinction Award, the Outstanding Texan Award presented by the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. She was also awarded the Ford Foundation Doctoral Fellowship for Black Americans in the National Institute of Mental Health Fellowship in Societal Change and Human Development. But nothing on her resume can truly reflect the passion and the commitment and the character of someone whom I consider a friend and who has done an incredible job at Kentucky State. Dr. Mary Sias, welcome.
Thank you,
We'll make the
Mr.
next
Chairman,
introduction.
and thanks for holding this hearing on historically black colleges and universities. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Earl Stanford Richardson, who's the 11th president of Morgan State University in Baltimore. A native of Maryland, Dr. Richardson earned the Bachelor of Arts degree in Social Science from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore and the Masters of Science and Doctor of Education degrees from the University of Pennsylvania. He has been a fellow of the Ford Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation and has conducted extensive research on critical problems in higher education relevant to racial autonomy, desegregation, and integration. Since becoming president of Morgan State University, Dr. Richardson has fashioned an all-encompassing strategy for strengthening academic programs and stabilizing student enrollment. And Morgan now leads Maryland colleges and universities in the overall production of African-American baccalaureates and in the number of undergraduates in mathematics, science, and engineering. The lodestar of Dr. Richardson's leadership at Morgan State University and in higher education is his commitment to establishing a strong foundation of excellence and achievement in the African-American community. I just want to say I've had the opportunity to talk at some length with Dr. Richardson about the challenges that face historically black colleges and universities. He is a creative thinker and I think brings an important perspective to the discussion today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And again, welcome to all of you. Secretary O'Leary, we're going to begin with you. You will have 5 minutes to make your case. The green light will go on when you begin to speak, a yellow light when you have about a minute to wrap up, but we expect you to complete your thoughts and good, clear sentences, and then a red light will come on.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh,
Yes,
such a challenge, Mr. Chairman.
Before she starts, you didn't call on me in time to introduce her, but Secretary Leary is from Newport News, Virginia, and we'd like to especially welcome.
And we all know Mr. Scott's from Newport News, Virginia.
Surely do.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The chairman has touched upon it. That is, I have so little time and so much to say. So I brought a picture, but only you can see it. This is my favorite picture of Fisk University. It's a graduation with the young people wearing the cloth traditional of Ghana. And that's a good place to begin with Fisk University. We are proud to report that our retention rate is at 86%, meaning our freshmen get into the sophomore year. And there we can hold them except for financial crises. Our graduation rate is at 65%, ranking us 10% ahead of the graduation rate of all majority schools in the United States of America. We've been recognized by the Chronicle of Higher Education for doing the best job of graduating low-income, first-generation students. But perhaps more importantly, as my students would want me to tell you, we hook them up. And by hooking them up, I mean they go on to graduate school or they go right into the world of work. Some 70% of the students at Fisk University enter a graduate program. We like to talk about some of our steeples in academia. Fisk University holds the distinction of producing the largest number of African Americans who go on to earn a PhD in the natural sciences. That is stunning because normally our population of students is at about 900. We're on track in the next year to take that title with respect to physics graduates with PhDs. I can point out to you that this year, 15 African Americans entered a PhD program in physics. 9 of them were graduates of Fisk University. That's the good work we're doing. We are very proud of our academic excellence. For 16 years in a row, the Princeton Review has rated Fisk University in the 85th percentile of quality in education among colleges and universities in America. Recently, the U.S. News and World Report did a survey of historically black colleges and universities, 86 of them. Fisk ranked number 5. Now, maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we would have ranked number 1. But it's important to tell you that we have managed to do this with an endowment of $7 million. Now, if that were the good face of Fisk, there is a face of Fisk that needs to be getting a little more makeup, as it were. We are very blessed this year to have caught the attention of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, recognizing that Fisk needs very quickly to build their endowment. They have given us $1 million outright and set a challenge to give us another $2 million if Fisk can raise $4 million by the 30th of June. I'm happy and proud to tell you that we're approaching the 2 million mark, and my suitcase is packed all the time, so I know we're going to get there. I want to go now to the heart of our problems, recognizing I have 1 minute and 10 seconds, and say to you that it is all about capital at a place like Fisk. 142 years old in October. We're the first university in Nashville, and we're blessed to have a campus that is listed on the Register of Historic Sites. But with that comes an overwhelming requirement to take care of these beautiful buildings. When I arrived, deferred maintenance, last study done in '95, was at $19 million. Fast forward and re-up that analysis, we're over $30 million in deferred maintenance. Here are the things that really work for us. If anybody has looked at Fisk's history and background, we would not have these stellar programs in science without congressional support. We have 5 centers of excellence that are supported by agencies of government. Not the Department of Energy, but I think we can work on that one. The other thing that's valuable to us are all of the grants coming to Fisk University out of Title III, both for operation and enhancement of our program, and most importantly, to use to lever endowment. So as that Title III gets whittled away, opportunities for more capital to invest in a great university cease to exist. But we're going to do our job at any rate. I'm a proud graduate of Fisk University. I say to my kids, I came out in the last century. And the difference between today's Fiskite and yesterday's is that we are meeting the needs of brilliant and excellent low-income and first-generation college students. And I believe that that is our correct mission. I thank you for the opportunity to sum up. All right, I'm going to get it done in a hurry. Every university represented here has a great story to tell. And I know that I'm talking to the choir in this particular church to say that I understand that you understand our need. The difficulty we will all have is with capital for the near term and the long term. I just want to cite you an example. At Fisk, I looked it up before I left, of course. Our debt service is approximately 10% of our budget. It could be a lot less if I could simply, or Fisk could simply, refinance those loans. We will always carry debt. We can't carry much more because everything at Fisk is already collateralized. And I would point out to all of you, another thing that you know is that we are collateralized at too high a level. We will do our job. We look very much forward to working with this committee And I've had some great jobs in my life, but none as great as being the president of Fisk University. I thank you for this opportunity.
Is the light on yet? Okay. Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKeon, I appear before you today to thank you for passing the College Opportunity and Affordability Act of 2007 and reauthorizing and strengthening the Higher Education Act of 1965. I come from the 12th District in North Carolina, Johnson C. Smith University, the home of Congressman Mel Watt. I appear before you to share some of the many ways in which provisions in this act has helped Johnson C. Smith become a leader among private liberal arts colleges. As I always say at Johnson C. Smith, we've always been able to wash clothes without washing powder. We have been recognized, that's right, we've had so little for so long that we've learned to live with it, but we could always use more. We have a small endowment of $53 million, and we're the beneficiary of the Duke indenture. Over the years, we've been recognized by U.S. News and World Report as one of the best comprehensive colleges in the South since 2001. We are recognized as the first and only HBCU laptop university where all students are given laptops. In 2007, we were also ranked in the top 10 of HBCUs in America by U.S. News and World Report. But we are most proud of what happened in 2000 when Yahoo ranked JCSU as one of the top 50 most wired small colleges. I therefore encourage you to settle and all of your differences on House H.R. 694, the Minority Servant Institution Act regarding digital and wirelessness, because we all need that. Most of our students, or many of our schools, are only 88% in terms of their connectivity, in terms of just the basic connectivity, and 45% of the students at our schools, HBCUs, do not have laptops. I'd also like to remind you as to why we exist. We exist because we serve a particular population. We were created at a particular time when special purpose institutions were created, as you've already mentioned. But we must remind you constantly that we are not obsolete, that we must continue to exist. If we didn't exist, you would have to create us. The most powerful reason for our existence has to do with economics. Educational preparation resulting in higher income levels strengthens America's society. Everyone knows that a college graduate will always earn more than a non-college graduate, even though we know that the average African American with a bachelor's degree will earn $1.7 million a year in a lifetime, whereas a white college graduate will earn around $2.1 million. We play a critical role in fulfilling the higher education gap, and we plug what we call the economic gap, which was first identified by the Kerner Commission. You've already stated that there are so few of us, 4%, yet we graduate so many, 30% of African American students. But there is another problem here. According to the data from the NSF, 6 of the top 20 predominantly white institutions receive more federal funds for research than 79 HBCUs combined. If we are to have adequate research facilities and if we are to be competitive, we must receive more federal funds for research. I would argue that a continued investment in HBCUs is a good investment for this country and for this nation. Johnson C. Smith was created in 1867 by the Presbyterian Church. And somewhere along the way, you know, Presbyterians can be quite feisty. We seceded from the church in 1868, and so we've been an independent institution ever since. But there is something I really would like to thank you for, and that has to be the Title III funding. Title III, since 1997, Johnson C. Smith has received more than $17.5 million. We have used these funds, and we have pinched the pennies. We have developed technology infrastructures. We've dealt with aging facilities, maintenance, upgrades, and renovations. We've dealt with personal resources. We've dealt with data management infrastructures, institutional planning and effectiveness and assessment, and student success and persistence to graduation. And we've also looked at alternative funding. But we've also institutionalized many of the programs that we have started. We, for example, have built an information center, an Office of Mobile Computing. We have an institutional planning, assessment, and effectiveness program, sponsored programs, research, academic retention and support services, faculty development, facilities management, tutorial services, and discipline-based computer technology. What I'm trying to tell you is that you've given us some dollars. We've taken these dollars and we've institutionalized them. We have not simply thrown them to the wind. The one concern that I have here is Title IV. Title IV is a great program. 83% of my students are receiving financial aid. But as I look at my students, they are being impacted disproportionately by the economy. For example, we have this year 1,000 students applied for the family, I call them parent loans. Only 500 of them qualified because of bad debt. That meant that many of those students had to go to alternative loans, which have high interest rates. Of those students, I had 15% of my students acquiring alternative loans. So you need to understand that the economy has impacted us. I read an article that came out yesterday that said less than 10% of the students in this country were getting alternative loans, and they were all at for-profit institutions. That simply is not true. They are also attending our schools, and they are being impacted in a disproportionate way. I would argue that Pell has to be increased, which you've already agreed to. I would argue that the Title II teacher quality enhancement provision has to be strengthened. I would argue that in terms of challenges, endowments have to be dealt with. We probably have one institution with an endowment of more than $500 million. That is a crisis. You have to have money in order to continue to strengthen your programs, pay your bills, and just do the things that you have to do to have a successful institution. The other thing that we need to look at is sustaining leadership within our institutions. I'm retiring. I'm looking forward to it. But I also know that the pipeline of presidents, CFOs, provosts, et cetera, is fairly thin. And there also needs to be something done about the training of trustees and people who sit on these boards from the state levels who determine what happened in our institutions. Sometimes they know little or nothing about education, but they become experts once they're appointed. But that's about all I have to say. I'll take questions afterwards. Thank you very much for your time.
Well done, Dorothy.
Good morning, Chairman Miller and members of the House Committee on Education and Labor. I appreciate you affording me the opportunity to speak to you this morning. And my remarks will really center on two things: the continued viability of historically black colleges and universities, and the expansion of Section 326E1, eligibility of historically black graduate institutions programs contained in H.R. 4137, Section 306. When I read the newspapers daily and I listen to the news, I see that we have challenges, and we will continue to have those challenges confront us for a very long time in our complex world. Solutions are not going to come from simply the privileged few who've had the opportunity for a quality education, but rather from those whose ACT and SAT scores may be modest, but they have had a chance to receive a quality education at historically black colleges. Our strength as a nation must come from how we structure and afford our students quality educational opportunities. For more than 100 years, more than 105 HBCUs and universities provided access and opportunity not only to black students, but to underserved students who wanted a chance. They have stood, HBCUs have stood in the gap and served as a bridge for those students. Now, as an HBCU president, I'm often asked, are HBCUs vital? Do they continue to be relevant? And my answer is always a resounding yes. But there are some in this country, people like George Madison Professor, Walter Williams, and other syndicated columnists who have mistakenly represented what life at HBCUs are really like. Dr. McNeely, a colleague who's sitting behind me, said that what they've said is akin to yelling fire in a theater when there is none. That's not acceptable as legitimate free speech because of the harm that it does. What's even worse is when you have someone who's not there, who hasn't seen anything, who took what someone else said, and on secondary information yells that there is a fire. That's even worse because it perpetrates an untruth and does great harm. HBCUs didn't create the problems or challenges they face. Rather, they've stood at the forefront of the fray, ready to help find solutions. Let me tell you, I know you know the numbers. I know you know how many students we enroll. I know you know how many people we graduate. I'm not telling you everything is great. It isn't. Like our counterparts, we should be graduating more students. And if we have more resources and we can build our capacity, we will graduate more students. We want to graduate students who can critically think, who can integrate knowledge, who can speak concisely and coherently, and who can use technology. These are the students who stand in the forefront. These are the students that we're going to count on to lead us and become the next generation of leaders. For K-State and other HBCUs, we take the terror of poverty, hunger, fear, and hopelessness, and we turn it into hope. And with a little bit more money and capacity, we can do even more. That leads me to my second point. I would like to talk a little bit about how we need more graduate programs. The reauthorizing legislation proposed amendments to Section 326 that would, among other things, allow a limited number of master's degree programs to receive grants in much the same manner that the HBBI program began by admitting a small number of qualified institutions. The Senate bill would allow Coppin State University, Fayetteville State, Grambling, West Virginia, and Kentucky State to receive grants for our eligible graduate and professional programs. I know you know this, Representative Yarmouth. The Senate has made this inclusion based on its interpretation of the language. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I want you to know that I know, and I know you know, that the language says qualified graduate programs mean graduate or professional programs that provide program of instruction in physical and natural sciences. It doesn't say terminal programs or anything else of the sort. Kentucky State University has a national reputation for our program in aquaculture. We believe that we meet every element of that program language, and we want to be included in the non-competitive language. The program appeared to the Senate and appears to K-State to meet all those qualifications. I know this committee disagrees and has taken a position that the language appears to apply to graduate and professional programs without limitation to terminal degrees. I want to ask you to reconsider that in your conference hearing. Please do so. And I want you to know that I hope the Senate will continue to keep us in that language. And I want to thank the committee, however, for committing and creating H.R. 4137 as an alternative to HBCU master's degree programs in Title IV of the Act. Kentucky State would be eligible, but that's not enough. We want to be eligible on the non-competitive side. In closing, I want to thank you for your commitment to historically black colleges and universities. By your actions every day, you tell us that you want to support the next generation of students. Our journey begins today, and I know we can count on you. My grandmother is from the country, and she told me when I stood out watching her feed the chickens and churn butter that, honey, why are you standing up there not doing anything? And I said, Grandma, nobody told me to be involved. And she said, don't ask or be told what to do. Just simply assign yourself. Thank you. HBCUs have been assigning themselves every day, and we want you to join us in that challenge. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Dr. Richardson?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. McEwen, for your support, Congressman McEwen, over the years, and now to Chairman Miller. Let me just say that I appreciate the introduction by my Congressman John Sarbanes, and he and I have talked over and often about the value of our black colleges. I appear today to join my colleagues in, yes, talking about the great value and contribution of our historically black colleges, but more important, to emphasize the great potential and the great promise that these institutions have for addressing some of the more vexing problems related to the social, economic, and political welfare of our society. I'm passionate about this because I believe that the realization of that promise is fleeting. And with every fleeting moment, I believe the impact on our society is devastating. At this point in time, I think that it has been now about 5 decades, a little better than 5 decades since Brown. It has been over 4 decades since Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It's been more than 16 years since Fordyce. And yes, much has been done to improve our historically black colleges, but nowhere near the amount that needs to be done to make us comparable to our white counterparts. Nowhere near enough to make us as competitive in attracting students regardless of race and regardless of their academic achievement levels. And so I think that there is now an urgency. There is an urgency about moving us toward that standard of comparability that we have been striving for now over a half century. In the state of Maryland, the demographics are moving so quickly that now you are seeing, as you saw in the Washington Post just a few days ago, about what the changing demographics are in our country. And just a few months before then, there appeared in the Sun paper of Baltimore a similar article. And we oftentimes talk about the relevance of that for our institutions of higher education. Well, those demographics are briefly saying to us that the minorities that we have so often spoke about are now very shortly going to be the majority. And those are the persons that are experiencing the greatest difficulty in terms of educational achievement and in terms of how they are able to move from the elementary secondary level to the post-secondary level. Yet, this is the pool, this is the pipeline from which this country will have to draw the workforce. And so we believe that it is imperative that we move to now ensure that these institutions that have served that minority population very, very well, that they now be made equal to and comparable to the majority institutions in our state and in our country. As I look at what is happening in our own state of Maryland, by the way, I am a native of Maryland. I went to elementary school there. I went to high school there. I got my undergraduate degree there before going on to the University of Pennsylvania. And so I have a long history with it. I was there in the 60s when we were marching in the streets, marching to remove the separate but equal, and for us, separate and unequal. And it pains me now that even 50, almost 60 years later, that we still have not achieved that higher mark that we were striving for in the 60s. But I want to emphasize here that I think that that promise is still before us. I think that that promise can be realized if indeed that we can move within our states on some of the compact agreements. In the state of Maryland, we had a compact agreement, several, but the last one lasting from 2000 to 2005. And after that, of course, the state of Maryland did indeed send a report in saying that we had indeed complied with all of the requirements of that. Later on, a group that represented the interests of our historically black colleges, the Maryland Coalition for Equity and Excellence in Higher Education, submitted a rejoinder questioning many of the positions in that document. We still are waiting to find out what the disposition is of, one, the agreement, two, the response of our state, and three, the rejoinder that was submitted by the third party on behalf of our historically black colleges. You've heard from Congressman Sarbanes of Morgan's productivity within the state of Maryland, the largest producer of African Americans. And we've heard the term over and over again, African American, or we've heard the term historically black colleges. Let me simply say, you should not be uncomfortable with the term. Historically black college as a designation represents a fact of history and not a statement of exclusion. We are open to students regardless of race, and yes, the difference between our institutions and the other institutions is that yes, we want some of the most talented students. We want as many as we can get. But within our community, according to the standards that are now used on SAT scores, that represents only 12 to 15% of our students. And we happen to believe that you can't just discard the other 85%, that we have to find some way to move that other 85% to a level that they can be productive citizens, that they can too move through our elementary and secondary schools and then to our post-secondary schools and become the productive citizens that you want. We can make them the scientists and the engineers and the teachers and the professors, all of those things, but indeed it has to be under the circumstances that we provide to our students at our other institutions. So let me just sum up by saying, Mr. Chair, I think that our historically black colleges have done an excellent job over the years, and I think they hold great promise for these changing demographics. And if, in fact, we can have our institutions develop to a level of comparability and parity so that we are as competitive as other institutions in attracting students regardless of their race and regardless of their background and regardless of their academic achievement. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned in your introduction, I am currently the Dean of the School of Law at North Carolina Central University, one of only 4 historically black law schools accredited by the American Bar Association, created during the days of apartheid and segregation. Prior to becoming Dean of the Law School, I served as the politically appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education in the Office for Civil Rights from 1993 to 2000. Clearly one of the first pressing matters to face the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education at that time was the recent decision by the United States Supreme Court some 4 or 5 months earlier in the Ayers v. Fordyce case that was mentioned by Dr. Richardson. And in that case, the United States Supreme Court set a new standard with respect to states compliance with the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution as it relates to the education of African Americans attending historically black colleges and universities, not just in the state of Mississippi, but throughout the country. The concern expressed by presidents of historically black colleges, universities, and the civil rights organizations was what would be the Clinton administration's and the Department of Education's response to that Supreme Court decision, in light of the fact that the country had been within a higher education desegregation docket, an effort of higher education desegregation docket going back to the 1970s that involved all 19 states in the United States of America that have publicly supported historically black colleges and universities. We took that Supreme Court decision and basically upgraded the federal policy on higher education desegregation to reflect what the United States Supreme Court said, which was basically that states have an affirmative duty to remove all vestiges of the past practice of segregation to the greatest extent practicable that have a present-day effect. Up to that time, we were operating under the old 1978 higher education desegregation policy, which basically was a 2-part policy designed to remedy the past practice of segregation by enhancing and strengthening historically black institutions to provide them with the educational opportunities that heretofore had been constricted because of days of apartheid and segregation. With the new policy, the Office for Civil Rights then went forward to enforce that policy by addressing those states that still had outstanding Title VI violations. Understand, Mr. Chairman, you have 7 states right now in this country that are continuing to receive federal dollars for educational purposes, higher education, that are operating with outstanding Title VI violations. Title VI meaning that law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or gender in entities receiving federal funds. I would question whether if there was a state in this country receiving federal funds for environmental purposes and yet that state was in violation of federal environmental protection laws, if that state would still be able to receive federal funds for its environmental purposes. But that is what you have going on here in our country. By the time we left the Department of Education in 2000, we had successfully negotiated settlement agreements with all the remaining states consistent with the new policy, settlement agreements that included some hundreds of millions of dollars of increased funding, educational programs, partnership agreements, quite a number of items that have been, for the most part, cooperatively entered into with the states and the federal government. Unfortunately, at the conclusion of our administration, it did not take long for at least for me to begin to hear calls and cries that states were retreating from those commitments. So much to the point where you probably have a clear case of a breach of contract between the federal government and states that had committed to doing certain things to bring their states in compliance with Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and address all concerns as enunciated by the Supreme Court with respect to the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. The non-field group that has us assembled here today asked our law school, the North Carolina Central University School of Law. By the way, one of your members is a proud graduate of our law school. That's Congressman G.K. Butterfield. Non-field asked our law school if we would examine the current state of the law to determine whether or not litigation could be brought against the federal government's Office for Civil Rights to make the Office for Civil Rights enforce its own compliance agreements, understanding that that was what was done back in 1977 to cause, at that time, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to get its Office for Civil Rights to actually enforce higher education desegregation policy. Our thought was that that would have to be done again. Unfortunately, unfavorable decisions going back to 1980 and 1989 and going forward have now made that difficult, almost impossible. I believe that the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education has some outstanding career employees. I worked with them. I supervised them. I hired many of them. But it is clear to me that the lack of enforcement of civil rights, federal civil rights policy at the Department of Education is an agenda. It is because it is not high on the list. The action is not wanted and appreciated, and therefore states are beginning to retreat from not only their commitments, but also engage in policies, educational policies that are quite frankly adverse to the health and well-being of historically black colleges and universities. And Mr. Chairman, I would ask that not only my testimony here, but the statements of this panel, which reference many documents that are contained in these appendixes, be admitted to the record. Thank you.
Without objection, we'll make them part of the record of this hearing. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony. One of the items that I mentioned in my opening statement was the incredible contribution of historical black colleges to our teacher corps in this country, and it's near and dear to my heart. And as we struggle with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, I think it's very clear to those of us on both sides of the aisle that we are in desperate need for this next generation of teachers to have great capacity to teach students at a depth and at a breadth that we're not doing today, so that they will have the ability, those students, and this is what we just met with all of the CEOs, and not all of them, but with various associations, but several dozen CEOs from the high-tech industry yesterday with the speaker talking about their educational needs, and they made it clear again, as best I can put it, is that they're going to need graduates of college and of high school who can work across their companies, across the country, and across the continents with the most diverse workforce in the history of the world, serving the most diverse customer base in the history of the world. And this takes a lot of skill and a lot of talent and a lot of depth of understanding. As much as we recognize that technology is changing the world, it also can change the classroom. And to now have teachers that are skilled, not knowledgeable, but skilled in the use of technology as we look at different kinds of assessments, of formative assessments, of the ability to bring into the classroom or have the classroom experience up and down the internet, across the broadband. We now need this generation to really be skilled in that effort. And Dr. Yancy, you mentioned that you're a laptop university, so I assume students are learning some of that. But I just wondered how you see that phasing into the issue or the question of teachers now coming to the classroom prepared for really the maximum utilization of technology in that education.
Teachers have to have access to technology. They don't have any choice. The students who are coming into the public school system or private schools, wherever they're coming from, come knowing how to deal with all kinds of gadgets. We've had the laptop since 2000, and we've been fully wired. The problem here is the cost of the infrastructure. I mean, we've had to pay to upgrade the infrastructure twice at Johnson C. Smith. We have students who don't have money, and so we lease our computers. We don't, you were talking about leasing textbooks, Congressman McKinnon. We have leased laptops, and we made it available to everyone. But there's a problem within the teacher education that is not always talked about. The NCADE accreditation process is very expensive. Nobody wants to talk about that. When they come in large teams. You have the state, you have the national group coming all together, and we have all these students that we have to prepare for, the library, et cetera. But then the problem that we have is encouraging the best and the brightest to go into teacher education because the salaries are so low for them to go out and teach. You know, you come out of school owing lots of money, having alternative loans. You've already worked 2 and 3 jobs just to get through college, and then someone wants you to work for $25,000, $28,000 a year. So what you have is the best and the brightest going to the best bidders sometimes, even when they've majored in teacher education. So it's not that we're not providing what they need to become great teachers and be diverse and be able to deal with all kinds of folk, think critically, and go in and just hit the ground running as teachers. You're going to lose them to corporate America, they've got no problem stealing the best and the brightest.
Listen, I have no problem losing them. I love that marketplace out there for that talent, and school districts are going to have to understand that it's no longer a closed market, and I think all of that will be helpful. My concern is that they're exposed to a curriculum and to experiences that make them ready in that classroom so that they can utilize you know, all of the benefits of technology. Not to suggest that replaces teachers, but the benefits that can now be brought, the ability of students, again, to work across state lines, across districts, across the country, to give their students a depth of education and a different kind of education to make them ready for that workplace in 2020, 2024. That's my concern. And that's the excitement to see that your students from day one are exposed to that and start to understand what that means, because you can still graduate from a school of education and not have any experience in technology. It's unbelievable that that's the case in this country, but that is. And you can still graduate and not have any understanding of IDEA, you know, in this country when people are confronted with special education.
Representative Miller, I come from the old school.
I'm not putting this burden on you.
No, I come from the old school
but I'm excited because of your contributions.
Truth in lending. If you say you're going to promise a student a quality, competitive education, then you have a requirement to do it. What we have here is a shortage of funds, and many of our—
I understand that. I understand that very well. And let me just say this. I think I was meeting with a group of Upward Bound students yesterday, and I think it's very important that we establish and your institutions establish a working understanding of the new arrangements and financing of their education. There are now opportunities available to them that weren't. You mentioned starting at a low salary. Under the contingent loan program, they don't have to pay back more than 15% of their salary in any 1 year. For those high-performing math and science teachers, they can get $4,000 of assistance while they're in school if they want to teach, and will teach afterwards. If they enter public service, if they enter the nonprofit world, if they want to become a prosecutor or a public health doctor or public defender or fireman, after 10 years in that profession, their loans go away. And we're also trying to coordinate within that loan to make sure that they understand all of the accesses that they have to the federal loan program before they take on private lending. Too often, private lending is directly marketed to the student. The student takes advantage of it and then realizes that they've got a headache on this one when they still had capacity within the federal program. So we've really tried to redesign this, but it's different than a lot of people assume, some of which leads them to the conclusion they can't continue their education, and it's not the case in many instances.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, Representative Miller. I guess what I'm really saying is many of our students are first-generation students. It's not that they've been told, not that they've been tutored and exposed to the possibilities of a loan or what happens to their loans and how they go away. When you're first generation and you graduate from college, I was in graduate school. I was first generation in my family. My sisters had gone to college. My father's position was, why are you staying to get a PhD? You need to get out and get a job. When these kids reach the point of graduation and there's someone waving a thing at $60,000, $70,000 in their face versus the other, it sort of hurts your heart to see them decide they're not going to be teachers at that point. And that's all I'm really trying to say. And the same thing is true about them going on to get PhDs. There's someone waving something in their face, particularly those in computer science. We're #1 in the Carolinas in the production of African Americans in computer science and computer engineering. I have to just pull hen's teeth to get them to go into graduate school. And that's all I'm really trying to say.
All right. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love these hearings on education. They always bring up more problems than solutions, but it really makes you think about how far we've come, but how far we need to go. And I hear discussions about competition between the schools where we really need to, if we could all pull together and understand that the competitions shouldn't be between the schools or the classes of schools or the kind of schools we have, proprietary schools, black colleges, traditional schools. Our competition is China, India, other places around the world. And if we don't prepare our, as the chairman said, diverse workforce to handle all the diverse needs, I don't think our children and grandchildren are going to have the kind of lives that we've had. So we have tremendous challenges before us. Talking about teacher pay, I served on a school board, local school board, for 9 years, and we had a couple that were our best math science teachers in the district, and they left to go to work for industry. They tried to stay as long as they could. Finally, it got too much, and they couldn't afford to stay. That's a problem. However, we also have teachers that are overpaid. The way the system works, all teachers are paid the same when they are hired, and after a couple of years, some of them have shown that they're much better teachers than others, but they're still paid the same because steps and columns, the way it works. I know that the chairman in the reauthorization of higher education has tried to work on differential pay and some other things like all other industries have. But in teaching, it's just everybody's the same, and I think that causes real problems. Dr. Yancy, you talked about the problems with loans, the interest, and getting loans, and I am really concerned that we're heading for major problem, that the things that have hit the housing industry are coming also to the student loan industry, whether it be the government program, the private financing. The problem with getting capital is going to cause some real problems. I don't know, I would like you all to address that. If you're hearing from lending companies the problem of getting loans for the students for this coming summer and fall, and what you're seeing in that area. And Mr. Pierce, the point that you brought out on the fact that we're not enforcing laws, I think that is a national problem, not just in civil rights, but in other areas, selectively enforcing laws. I see people, my constituents, very concerned about illegal immigration. You know, it looks like some laws we enforce, some we don't. You run a stoplight, you get a ticket. If you're here in the country illegally, it's just we look the other way. You know, and that really concerns me. I would like you to address, if you could, the problems that you faced with your time in the department in trying to get civil rights laws enforced. And you talked about how you've seen that fall off since you left the office.
Congressman, at the time, we actually, for the most part, in totality, realized a great deal of cooperation from the states. Now, there were some states at that time that were very recalcitrant. Ohio was definitely one of them. But for the most part, the remaining states worked with us. It was Secretary Richard Ryder was Secretary of Education at that time. It was his desire that we work in partnership with the states to pull together compliance plans that would bring these states in compliance with federal law, and we did just that. However, it didn't take long when we left for states to begin to retreat from not only those agreements, but stated federal higher education desegregation policy that states clearly that certain initiatives and policies by states in the world of higher education would have an adverse impact on the desegregation process in higher education. One of which was and continues to be, because it's federal policy, and that is the unnecessary duplication of educational programs. Now, we know that in the days of apartheid and segregation, to have a school of journalism at Florida State University, the traditionally white institution, right across the street from Florida A&M, the traditionally black institution, was the way life was, to keep the races apart. If you were black and you want to get a degree in journalism, you have to go to Florida A&M. If you're white, you go to Florida State. That's just the way it was. Part of the federal policy was to remove those policies, just like racial steering in real estate, is to remove those policies and say, look at what your state needs in terms of higher education, whether it's more law enforcement officers, environmentalists, scientists and biotechnology, whatever, and then use that to craft the educational offerings in the state system of public higher education commensurate with those demands. So you would not duplicate programs unnecessarily. They would only continue segregation. So to place a school of pharmacy, sort of say, at Texas Southern University, which would attract a more diverse student population, or the School of Physical Therapy at Langston University in Oklahoma. I gave the commencement speech there. I think 30% of the graduates of that class in physical therapy were white students. Why? Because there's a quality program there that is attracting students. So, but now you have a retreat from that. I think Dr. Richardson can attest to this. We put part of the DSEG plan was to place a doctoral degree in education at Morgan State University. Now you clearly see, after the sheriff left town, as you see other colleges in the state system of higher education in Maryland encroaching upon that degree right down the road from his university. And that goes on and on and on. Land grabs, money that was committed to historically black colleges and universities has been removed. So yes, I mean, it's a clear difference, but it was the same thing during the Reagan-Bush years that preceded us. There had been a lull in the enforcement of the higher education desegregation, not as much, because interestingly, Clarence Thomas, when he ran the Office for Civil Rights, he was the person that found 3 of those states in violation of federal civil rights laws and sent one of them to the Department of Justice for litigation. I believe if Clarence Thomas can see that, anybody should be able to see that. So no disrespect to the justice, but clearly there has been a difference in how federal civil rights law has been enforced since from the years 1993 to 2000 and 2000 to now.
Congressman, if I might add, just for the record, a correction on the record, we actually had the doctoral in education program, the doctoral programs that came as a result of the efforts under Dean Pierce here were doctoral programs in history, engineering, math, and science education. The programs, of course, that we've most recently been talking about is the MBA program that was just duplicated about 1.5 years ago, and that was a continuation of the duplication that we think is very harmful, not only in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of the diversity issue, which it was intended to address from the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. McCann. Secretary O'Leary, in your testimony, you mentioned that if you can admit and support a student in his or her first year, then there's an 86% chance you'll be able to retain them into the second year, and your graduation rate is about
65%.
Which is higher than the national.
It's 10% higher than the average in the United States of America. That's correct.
What strategies do you use to achieve that success?
Well, there are actually three, but I'm going to talk about them in two prongs. The first one is the finances. You've really got to work with these students, 91% of whom at Fisk are on financial aid. And earlier, Chairman Miller asked the question with respect to third-party loans. Well, at Fisk, we're working with one of our major banks in Tennessee to ensure that there is a backup available for our kids if other financing runs out. The other piece of it, to move to the advisement side, has to do with the size of Fisk University. Our student-to-faculty ratio is 12-to-1. So like it or not, you can't get into too much trouble academically or socially. I would say I know easily 30% of our kids by name, by degree program. But the other thing that occurs in such an intimate surrounding is that the advisement of these students is unique and personal, and it moves beyond the advisor for the degree program. But we also have a series of advisors whose responsibility it is to look after our students and intervene at least by mid-semester if there's a problem with academics. So we pretty much have them locked on our 42-acre campus, and we give them that kind of attention.
That is a remarkable record.
Thank you, sir.
It's not cheap to do that, but it certainly has produced a high degree of success.
Indeed, it is not cheap, as our endowment will attest. Well before I arrived, others saw these needs for our students and unwisely dipped into endowment to support these initiatives. And now we're working to find money outside of those needs to put that endowment back. But we're very proud of our record.
Good.
Thank you.
Mr. Pierce, what is the purpose of the partnership agreements between the states and the OCR? Is it a settlement in lieu of a lawsuit?
Exactly, Congressman. Of the original 19 states that were involved in federal litigation or investigations, all of them except for 5 were able to present plans to resolve their violations. 5 of them had to go to court. Again, one of them all the way to the Supreme Court. That was Mississippi. And our Department of Justice prosecuted those cases. All the remaining states said, okay, Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, we'll sign a document saying we'll commit to do the following over a certain period of time, which hopefully at the end of that implementation period, you will find us in compliance. That was what those plans were designed to do, to bring the states in compliance with federal education policy by removing the vestiges of that practice of segregation that continued having effects to the day.
After the partnership agreement expires, is there expiration date on it?
Yes, sir. Most of those plans are maybe for some 5 years.
Then what do you do then? Does the state's obligation end at that point and you renegotiate, or?
No, the obligation doesn't end. The obligation is on the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to then conduct an analysis to determine whether or not what the state committed to do actually had the effect of addressing the violations to the point that they could be removed. In many cases, those plans expired, and the states were informed by the Department of Education to continue doing what you're doing, and we will get to you and ultimately make an analysis as to whether or not you are in compliance. Unfortunately, that has not happened. All the plans that I negotiated, Congressman, have expired, and those states are still under a continuing obligation to implement those plans to the letter and to the spirit.
I thank you very much for that information, and I appreciate the work you did during your time there with the department. I can recall recall those years, and we talked a few times at that time.
Yes, sir.
Also,
Yes, sir.
so-
I remember being in your office.
Right, yeah, I remember that very much. We have a vote on in the House, but I think we have time to get Mr. Keller from Florida in to ask a question. Then I think I'll run over to the House and cast my vote and get back there as soon as I can. But
Well,
Mr. Keller.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. I'm looking at your book here, and the very first topic says expanding access to college, and that's the topic I want to touch about. I'm chairman of the Pell Grant Caucus here in Congress and a big fan of Pell Grants. I myself wouldn't have been able to go to college without Pell Grants. When you look at the demographics, about 80% of Pell Grants go to minority students. Now here's the challenge. 90% of the students getting Pell Grants come from families making $40,000 or less. And the biggest problem that's raised for me is parents will come to me and says, well, I'm a firefighter, my wife's a teacher. Together we make about $70,000. So we're too rich for Pell Grants, but not rich enough to pay for our kids to go to school. And we got 2 little girls in high school. And there's a very limited amount of tax incentives that will help them. Hope tax credit, a small deduction if you're under a certain amount. What would you give us advice to remedy that situation for the people who need the help to help access college, but they're just over the Pell Grant limits to open the doors for your universities? Dr. Richardson, you got some thoughts about that?
Okay. Congressman, I think that the financial aid issue is perhaps the most vexing issue for our historically black colleges and is very much associated with the retention and graduation rates. If you were to look at most of our institutions, you're going to find just that statistic that you just mentioned, about 90% on student financial aid. And what we have tried to urge is, yes, increasing the Pell Grant, because that is the first line of defense for most of our students. But the second is to provide additional dollars through other kinds of assistantships and research assistance and all kinds of ways when we get the grant monies and all of those things through the federal structure. We've also tried to give back more money from our own institutions. You're going to find in most instances that our institutions heavily subsidize our students.
Including the students who aren't eligible for Pell Grants because their parents make a little bit too much, but yet they still don't have enough money to go?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We understand that dynamic. Sometimes when you're talking to those or the policymakers, they don't always understand that. They think that because the parents make $75,000, then there should be enough money. But yes, there is that threshold there that will make the difference between whether or not a student matriculates or does not matriculate. And oftentimes the institution has to try to find money. Now, when the institution provides those dollars, you're taking from the same pool of students from which you must hire your faculty, build your technology infrastructure, and all of those kinds of things. You will also note that our institutions, on average, charge far less. If you were to look at my institution and compare it to its Carnegie counterparts in the state, our majority institutions who are all, say, doctoral research, I'm about $2,000 less on tuition. That means I automatically forfeit every year $8.5 million. Then I come back and I subsidize those students further with institutional aid.
And it depends on what your endowment is, too. I know, like, Harvard has a $36 billion endowment, so it's easy for them.
No, we don't have those
You don't
kind
have
of endowments.
I was telling the Harvard people I was this close to going to Harvard. That was how thick my rejection letter was. But Dr. Yancy,
Congressman Keller,
yeah.
When you make a certain amount of money, which is not enough money to send your kid to college,
Right.
you're sort of caught in a never land.
Right.
And that's when we get down to the loans that parents and students engage in,
Right.
which means that they have a tremendous burden when they leave college. at my institution, we've spent a lot of time trying to raise money for scholarships, and we have a few. But if you fall under a 3.0, you're in a neverland again. So
Right.
from 2.0 to 3.0, there's no one wants to give you money for a kid who's, quote, not on the honor roll.
Right.
So that becomes another problem. So you have to provide jobs. You have to help them find jobs. Or you have to get grants from MARC, MBRS, all kinds of research grants where you can engage students in those kinds of things. But there's just very little money for that group that's in between. This sort of betwixt and between group. It's sort of like the preteen that you can't find clothes for.
Right. Well, thank you. Dr. Sias?
At this point, we'll take a brief recess. They're rather tight on the time for the votes now. But Mr. Andrews is on his way back, and he will take the chair. And I'll be on my way back. It's one of those days we're trying to finish the session up, but we apologize for these interruptions. Your testimony's been great, and stick right there. We'll be right back.
But now, is there any of the generation?